Welcome to Finding the Frame. My guest on today's podcast is cinematographer, filmmaker, and master visual storyteller Adam Newport-Berra, whose varied and ambitious work can be seen captivating audiences weekly in the studio on Apple TV Plus. It's also in feature films such as Creative Control and Last Black Man in San Francisco and Blink Twice. And if you're a fan of music videos, he's worked with artists like Kendrick Lamar, Adele, Miley Cyrus, and Green Day. Adam, welcome to Finding the Frame. So let's dive a little bit into your background first of all. You started off shooting skate videos in Oregon, your home state, I believe.
I did, yeah. I spent most of my time skateboarding with my friends, snowboarding with my friends. And when I was in middle school, I broke my leg pretty badly and couldn't skate for a while, and convinced my parents to help me save up and bought a shitty mini DV camcorder and just started filming my friends and really fell in love with it to the point where I hardly slept when I was a teenager because I would just film all day and come home and then edit all night. And I just fell in love with it.
How did you find that shaped your cinematography career? How did it shape, that early hands-on style? Did it shape the way that you shoot nowadays?
To a degree, I would say, yeah. I mean, I think what really shaped me was more than my own work was just watching skate videos growing up. I think growing up in the 90s and early aughts, there were so many incredible filmmakers making skate videos. Trans World was making incredible stuff. They really put resources and energy into making really unique videos. Um, and Spike Jones was making a lot of stuff back then, and he is super inspiring. And it was cool to see how he could dabble in the world that he came up in, but also be making amazing, incredible feature films. And well, I think what it did for me was when I eventually went to film school, I was the kid who knew how to use a camera better than anyone else. So it just was natural that I would grab the camera. I didn't go to film school thinking I was going to be a cinematographer. I think like most kids, I just wanted to be a director. I wanted to make my own movies. But I very quickly realized that not everyone was as proficient as I was around the camera. So, when we got into groups to make stuff, I was always the guy holding the camera, and that just kind of pushed me to get more hours behind it and start to learn how to take people's vision and shape it.
How did that knowledge of cameras move then from your, to quote your shitty DV, mini DV? What different cameras did you move on to? Did you start experimenting with like different films and different things like that?
Yeah, I mean, in film school, we were really lucky that we were able to still shoot film. I went to NYU, and we had a mix of digital and film, but you know, the sort of digital revolution hadn't totally kicked off yet, and the digital cameras still didn't look great. And so we shot a lot of 16 millimeter, and we even got to shoot some 35. Uh, so it started out with shooting with hand crank Bolexes and my favorite camera, which is the Area S that has the turret lens system on the front. They were using that during World War II. And it's just a total beast of a camera that could take anything and, shoot it anywhere. You just drop a battery belt on and try to throw some film in it, and you can shoot anywhere, anytime. So that's kind of where I got started. And, as I shot more and more film, I really started to fall in love with it. And, it also just really made me realize how important it was to be decisive with my shots, because you don't get to just shoot forever and ever. And that's kind of where my love of film started.
Yeah, I read somewhere. I was reading a few of your interviews, and I was listening to a few interviews that you've done. The past one that you did for Ari, that's quite a good one as well. Um, where you talked about your inspirations, and one of them was Robby Müller, the Dutch cinematographer. I wonder if you could speak to that, and what was it about Müller that you fell in love with, and that made him an inspiration to you?
Um, I mean, simply put, I think the images he creates are just so incredible and just consistently jaw dropping. And I think he chose material that I was fascinated by. The scripts he shot were great. The directors he worked with were incredible, and he always had a unique perspective on things. And I also just love that he had a kind of more punk approach to everything. He would always talk about how if he saw a beautiful sunset, he would immediately try to turn the camera away from it, and shoot shoot the opposite. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. You know, it's becoming easier and easier to shoot pretty images. I think you could say that, a hobbyist can get a decent camera and create an incredible photo. I mean, my iPhone can take incredible images, and I think something Robby did was figure out a way to make something beautiful but unexpected, and to take really simple moments or really simple locations and create something really magical and kind of haunting or enchanting about it. And I just found that really amazing. And he was always pushing his equipment to the edge. He was always pushing film stocks and lenses to the edge. And I think he was doing, he was taking risks that a lot of other people weren't taking. And I think it always, not always, but it really paid off for him. He was able to create some of the most iconic images in film history.
I think one of the things he said, he always liked the idea when he went to a rental house or anything like that. He liked it when they took the toys off the camera. You know what I mean? So he stripped it right down to what its basic was. You know what I mean? What was your first experience of Müller? What was your first film that you saw of his where you were like, this is actually really cool?
I think it was probably, what was it? It was probably, what movie am I thinking of? Down by Law. Is that what I'm thinking of?
Yeah, Jim Jarmusch.
Yeah.
The one that's in New Orleans.
Yeah, exactly, in black and white.
Yeah.
And that movie is just great. And it's, as like a teenager, it was just like, I thought it was the coolest movie ever. And it's just so striking. And at the end of the day, like, you don't come out of that movie thinking about the cinematography. You think about the performances and the story and the friendships and the characters, but you realize that his hand was behind how we were able to see that. And then from there, obviously, Paris, Texas is a classic.
Yeah. Lol Crawley was on just the other week, and he talked about Paris, Texas, and the impact it had on him. If anybody who's listening who's not, thoroughly into Robby Müller's work, there's a great YouTube documentary that's called "Living the Light." That's a really, really good documentary that talks about his groundbreaking camera work and all these different lighting methods that he uses and stuff. So that's really something that's quite a cool thing. Do you find yourself then going from that inspiration? Do you find that your relationship to tech and the camera toys, do you like stripping it down like Müller, or do you sort of indulge in tech and different things that are now coming to the fore?
I definitely don't indulge in it. I think I feel like I'm usually the last to know. I don't really track the tech news, and I find that I'll often be explaining a shot to my crew with tools that I think we can use, and they're like, there's a thing that already does that we can rent, that we can bring in. I'm like, oh, okay, show it to me. Cool, great. And then I have that in my lexicon. But I don't necessarily try to always be on the cutting edge of it. And again, I'm lucky that I have really talented, amazing crew that helps me find that stuff and shows it to me. And anywhere from my camera assistants to my key grip to the gaffer to the operators, they all are great at helping me discover those things. But for me, I always try to come at it from the simplest way possible, and I find that the tools then sort of fall into place. I never think of a shot thinking, how can I use this tool? It's really more about dreaming up a shot and then being like, how can we pull it off as simply as possible? And sometimes the simplest possible version is not very simple, but I always try to pare back as much as I can.
Yeah, I think my first interaction with your work was on The Last Black Man in San Francisco, which, for anybody who wants to know, it's on Hulu right now. You can watch that there. One of the things that I really like was, I think there's a long sort of, from reading about it as well, like a 140-foot dolly tracking shot that's going through San Francisco. Is that correct? When they're on this skateboard? Yeah. So talk me through that. What was your equipment they were using, and how did you come up with that shot? And why?
Which shot are you talking? So you're talking about
the shot when they're both. I think it's when they decided not to get the bus, and they decided that they wanted to go. Yeah. You know what I mean?
So there is a really long dolly shot, but that's not that. There's a long dolly. There is a really long dolly shot at the beginning of the film when the little girl is skipping along the street, and then we land on the preacher who's across from them at the bus stop. And that was that was actually the first shot that we shot of the entire film, day one. And it was a total nightmare because we had scouted this location, had planned it to a T. We had a tiny crew. This was a tiny movie. You know, I had like a few grips and a camera. Basically, that's it. And we had planned to have a pickup truck with a bunch of dolly track in it that was going to show up, and there were going to be grips walking behind it, literally just pulling track out, throwing it down, pulling out track, throwing it down, leveling it as quickly as possible because we had to get there at a certain, before sunrise, lay it. And we couldn't come too early because we had a whole day of shooting we couldn't just shoot that shot. So we couldn't burn too much time in the morning doing it. So I think we showed up an hour before sunrise. And when we showed up, that entire parking lane was full of trucks. And something had gone wrong with the permitting process. And so we panicked and we're like, okay, we're not going to get the first shot of the entire movie. We're just not going to get it. And, we panicked for a moment, and then we were able to work with the local law enforcement and some tow trucks, and we were able to find some of the owners. We were able to get up. There were probably like a dozen trucks there. We were able to get them out of the way. My guys, my 3 or 4 grips sprinted and literally just threw the track onto the ground, barely leveled it. And, we got the shot as the sun was rising. But, I feel like that pretty much perfectly encapsulates my filmmaking career, is that, people think that we have all these resources and all this time. And I, as a young person, I'd watch movies and be like, I could shoot that. I could create that image, like I know what tools they used. I think I could pull that off. But then you don't realize everything that's going on behind it, the chaos that's happening behind the scenes, and the limited amount of time and resources you have. And it's kind of a miracle anytime anything gets made.
Yeah, I think this was something that actually I was going to save this for later on in the interview, but it's kind of naturally bred into this. One of the things that fascinates me about you is your prep process. You know what I mean, and how meticulous you are, and therefore when something like that goes wrong, and we'll get into that, as I said, about your prep process. But when something does go wrong or something unexpected happens like that, you're able to pivot and you're able to kind of make adjustments on the fly, I suppose. Is that
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think it's all about having a great crew. For me, I'm nothing without my crew. But yeah, it's a matter of prep and just sheer will and gumption and just being dead set on pulling it off. And the way filmmaking is going, I think budgets are getting tighter and tighter, and therefore schedules are getting tighter and tighter. So again, it really is a miracle when you can pull anything off, and every day on set feels like a small miracle.
Yeah. So talk me through your prep then, because from what I read, that you create these huge PDFs, I suppose, where each scene is broken down into how you see it, so that everybody in your crew and everybody in your team knows what's going on, and that's quite meticulous, but also quite unique in that respect, I suppose. Just talk me through your prep process.
Yeah, I mean, every project is different. My dream prep process, which happens whenever the situation allows, is that I break down the script and basically every scene becomes a page in this book, and that page is littered with reference images, a working shot list, down to photos of the location. I'll have, if it's a PDF, I'll have links to videos I've taken. I'll create a whole Dropbox library of videos at the location so you can click through. It's kind of like an interactive PDF. And what I really like is, I'll organize it in story order, by the scene number. But then I'll also note what day we're going to shoot that scene. I'll usually try to write down like sunrise and sunset, so I know. And so basically when I look at the call sheet, I can be like, okay, we're shooting scene 45 tomorrow. I'll go to page 45 on my PDF, and it'll just have all that information there so I can refresh my brain. A lot of times I don't even look at the PDF by the time I'm shooting. Sometimes the act of creating it is all I need. It's kind of like studying for a test, for me, a lot of it is just like a personal process of organizing my thoughts. And I found over the past few years that not every director works that way. It's not something I do with the director, but sometimes directors don't love to shot list, or they don't love to be too specific. So I kind of have to do that work on my own in the background. and that's fine. I think every director is entitled to their own process, and I think that's what makes every project special. So I try to do these PDFs, but sometimes it can be a little more wabi-sabi and a little bit looser. I've definitely shot entire movies where we didn't shot list a single thing, and it's terrifying at first, but then you just get into a rhythm and you start going with it. But what I've actually found, more helpful recently is, creating lookbooks and creating sort of a visual Bible. And I often start really broad. Like when I come to a meeting, I'll often come with, an 80-page lookbook that just has hundreds of photos in it. And it can feel really overwhelming. But what I love is going through it with the director and kind of just getting a sense of what they're responding to. And sometimes we whittle it down to like 3 images. I've shot entire projects where I have one reference image that I'm like, this captures the tone and the energy of what we're trying to create. And sometimes the smaller, reference list is actually more helpful, and it helps us hone in more precisely.
And when you've got that kind of idea of what the director likes in terms of your lookbook and stuff like that, does that help you? I mean, I presume on most of your projects, are you operating as well as DP? Are you in control of the camera?
It's a mix. I really like to operate. The last film I did, I operated on, but the studio, for example, I did not operate on. The movie I'm prepping for now, I'm going to operate on. It really just depends. It depends on a lot of factors. It depends on how many cameras we're using. I love shooting one camera, but sometimes it makes sense to shoot two cameras. And when we're shooting two cameras, I prefer not to operate because then I can watch both monitors. If I'm operating one camera, there's someone else operating. It's really difficult to be paying attention to everything we're getting. So it really just it depends. But I started out my career operating everything, and then as I got onto bigger projects, it became more difficult to operate. I was at a point in my career where I was getting bigger jobs, but I didn't necessarily have the cachet of a cinematographer that could get everything you wanted. And in America, it's actually like a rule that you're supposed to have, on a union show, you're supposed to have an operator. And some producers are like, they don't even want you to operate, um, I was on a project where the producers refused to let me operate. Even, I've done projects where we've hired an operator and I've operated most of the shots. But I've been on, I was on a project where that happened, and it was, that project was frustrating for a number of reasons, and that probably should have been my sign that it wasn't for me. But at the same time, learning how to work with an operator has been a really valuable skill set for me. Um, Someone like Robby Müller, he operated everything. That was part of his style, and I love that, and I respect that, and I think that's great. But I've been really lucky to work with some of the best operators in the world, and that can sometimes unlock things that I didn't know I had in me. It helps me find shots that I wouldn't normally see, and it also helps me pull off things I wouldn't normally be able to pull off. So I think it's an asset to have a great operator, and it really just depends on the type of set I'm on and the project I'm on, whether I operate or not.
Yeah. That brings us, I suppose, quite nicely, really, to the studio itself. I mean, I know that you've worked in other things on other television projects as well. Euphoria, you shot the last 2 episodes and stepped into that after, Marcel Rev had designed the look of it, I suppose, and everything like that. And then The Bear, you designed the look yourself, I suppose, with all these different, camera zoom languages and things like that. But with regard to the studio, what were you trying to go for with regard to the language there and with regard to this one shot movement and everything like that?
Yeah, I think simply put, Seth and Evan really wanted to create a sense of anxiety and panic into the show, and they wanted to have it feel really stressful, really wild, and they just wanted to take the audience for a ride. And so that was sort of the mantra, and I just kind of took that and ran with it.
Yeah. So this freneticism of the camera and everything like that. What was there any specific thing that you looked at? I know that I read somewhere, I think it was a Variety article or something. They were talking about Robert Altman's The Player, and there was a talk of Soy Cuba in there as well, Mikhail Kalashnikov. But what were your thought process? What was your inspiration for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think The Player was kind of an obvious tonal reference just because it was about the film world. I mean, obviously our show looks very different than that, but that was something we really loved and homaged and kind of used as a North Star. My favorite reference was another film by the director of Soikuba, called The Cranes Are Flying, which is just, if you haven't seen it, it's one of the most incredibly shot films of all time. And it's similar to Soikuba, except I think wilder and more inventive with his camera work. And that was really my favorite reference for the film because they did a lot of stuff moving in and out of moving vehicles, moving through masses of people, um, and doing a really incredible job of moving from close up to wide that I thought was just so amazing that you could be close up on someone's really emotional, visceral experience and then move away from them and lose them in a space and then eventually find them again. Um, and I think it was also just a spiritual reference because they were able to do such incredible things with the camera that I really haven't seen anywhere else. And they did it in the 50s. And I think that was, to me, it was an important thing to keep remembering that they were able to do that 70 years ago. And I had no excuse not to pull off anything that we wanted to pull off. I've found very early in my career that saying no or saying something wasn't possible is not useful and not going to get you hired again. So, I would often get pitched these what feel like impossible scenes, or we would rehearse something, and Seth and Evan would look at me and be like, "We could shoot that, right?" And my initial response, my initial mental response is, "I don't know how the fuck I'm going to do that. We're going to have to break that up. We're going to have to figure something out." And I just take a deep breath and I say, "Give me 10 minutes. Let me talk to my crew. Let me walk around, think about it." And we always found a way to pull it off. And I think having movies like that in the back of my head always remind me that there's no reason to say no.
Yeah. Have they got the kind of same film knowledge that you've got? Were they able to reference things like Saikuba and things like that, and were sort of bringing in Birdman, whatever, their ideas?
100%. Yeah, Seth and Evan are massive movie lovers, and I think that's the reason they made this show. I think it's a love letter to the film industry and filmmaking. And so they brought tons of great references, and we locked in pretty quickly.
I think they reference you as well. They say that you were the person who kind of pushed them to keep focused on it being one lens, one camera. We shouldn't have a second camera kind of thing. Why was it that you didn't want a second camera? Was it just so that you would definitely focus on this one camera idea?
Yeah, I think, I've done a bit of, I've done, I've done some projects with two cameras and it can be useful, but I find in general it dilutes the approach in the filmmaking process and it dilutes the performances because people don't know what you're paying attention to. Um, and it pushes the director to pay attention to two different things at one time. Again, it's totally possible, and sometimes it's really important to shoot two cameras, but whenever I see an opportunity to say no to a second camera, I do it. I really only say yes to a second camera if I feel like it's the only way we're going to make our day, or if it's a really important performance beat where we really just need to see two actors at the same time in close up. But I really, really think that two cameras can be the enemy of of filmmaking at times. And there are some directors and DPs who are very, very good at it, but I really love the energy and spirit of a single camera show. And it just worked so well for us. And I think it makes everyone focus more. It makes every shot feel more important. And everyone just turns on. When there's that one camera rolling, we just know this is the only thing that matters right now. There's nothing to save you. There's nothing to save us in the edit room. And this is all we have. And I think people cherish that, and it becomes much more sacred of a process.
How many? This is probably a ridiculous question, but how many rehearsals takes was the kind of the average for each of the different things, or did it vary massively? You know what I mean, in terms of what you're doing.
We found because we were shooting all these scenes in one shot, we did a lot of one-ers during the season, and we kind of realized our average was around 8 to 16 takes. I would say take 12 is usually the money take. As the show went on, that number went down. We were getting closer to 8 takes on some of this stuff. Rehearsal wise, it's hard to say how many rehearsals we were doing because we were usually rehearsing it in pieces and workshopping little moments. You know, by the time we were able to rehearse the entire scene with the camera, we were ready to roll. So, you know what I mean? Like I think the rehearsals were more about like let's carve out this moment in the shot and just walk through it. And a lot of times it would just be me and the camera operator and the assistants and the stand-ins, just making sure that we knew where to be, how to dance with the actors. You know, a lot of times we would do that when the actors were going through hair, makeup, and wardrobe. But basically, what we would do is every day we would show up. Seth and Evan and I would walk the set with the script, talk about the scenes we were shooting, talk about generally the dynamic and the flow of the scenes, where we wanted to end up. We would talk about shot ideas we liked, angles we liked, and how we could try to sort of guide the actors to move through the space in a way that we were excited about. Then the rest of the cast would show up, and we would kind of give them a general idea of what we were thinking. We would just start talking through it. A lot of times, the first half an hour was literally just them standing in a huddle with the pages and just spitting out the words, because it is just like physically and mentally an exercise to just be able to memorize 8 pages of a script. So, it would start with them just talking through it, and then we would start to slowly place people in the set, start to move around. I would have an iPad that had the frame lines up. I'd be taking video and just kind of moving around, filming them. Sometimes in the middle of these read throughs, I would just kind of whisper to a cast member, maybe try walking over there, or we would just kind of guide them gently with our hand, like maybe try sitting down or like walking, this way. And we would just start to kind of slog through it and just, play around a little bit. And then as they became more comfortable and familiar with the material and there started to become some chemistry with the scene, then it would start to come alive. There'd be more movement. The camera would have more movement. The camera being still me with the iPad. I'd often have the operator right behind me, kind of watching what I was doing. And we would just ramp it up and up and up and figure out where the dead spots were, try to make them more interesting, and just constantly creating more energy with the blocking in the camera. And then we'd get to a point where we're like, okay, we feel like we know what the blocking is. Let's bring the real camera in and start rolling on not actually rolling, but recording rehearsals, and just seeing how the camera lens works in this scene. And eventually we'd all kind of look at each other and know when it felt right to start rolling. And then we would just start doing takes.
And what lens are you shooting on? You're shooting on a 21mm for the whole thing?
Yeah, 21 Master Prime, which I tested a few different lenses, and a few different focal lengths. We tried a 16 mil, we tried a 25 mil, we tried a 27 mil. And the 21 just felt really great. It felt right. It was really easy to get a wide shot of a space. I didn't have to back up too much. But close-ups weren't too distorted. There's obviously some distortion when we're in close, but there weren't a ton of close-ups. There's a lot of two shots, and I found it worked really well for like very intimate two shots. And that the Master Prime is great because the sharpness is really consistent. At different stops, it's really sharp, wide open, but it still has a nice texture to it. The close focus is amazing. You can get, 6 inches from someone's face and still be sharp, and I can rack from 6 inches to 60 feet and there's no breathing on the lens, so you don't feel any weird zooming. It's just a really versatile lens.
I suppose, like you said, with Kalasov's Cranes Are Flying, you can get in really close with people, and then you can pull back. Some of the shots. There's one that I watched just recently, the last episode that's come out. Obviously, I don't know when this podcast is going to come out, but the last episode that I watched was this one that was like a noir thriller style thing. You went, and I need to actually, because I'll be honest, I've sat and racked my brain. And it's become this. I suppose it's become this kind of thing that is quite exciting for me now as a film buff. Like, when you're watching something, you're not just watching the thing and saying how great it is. You're also talking about the behind the scenes and how the hell they captured that thing. You know what I mean? It's a little bit like that. So you're outside Chateau Marmont. You catch on Sunset Boulevard. You catch the car coming up, and I think my wife just told me how they did this, which is kind of ruined it because I was looking forward to talking to you today about it. then you get them in a two shot, and then you follow the car, or you literally come round with the car, literally attached to the car. It feels like into Chateau Marmont itself. So can you talk me through that shot just so that I could tell my wife that I didn't just find it out from her?
Sure. So I think we used, if I remember correctly, we had a Chapman crane, which is like a ride-along crane. It was built in the 60s. It's like one of my, I think it's maybe my favorite film tool. It's this beautiful truck from the 60s, diesel truck that also has like these crazy lead batteries in it that are, I don't know how old. Um, and it's cool because it's diesel powered, but when you're rolling it switches to battery so that it can this basically semi truck can move on batteries and be creeping silently. So there's a guy driving that. I think it's got about a 20-foot crane on it that has a platform that an operator can sit on. So we had, I believe it was Jesse Kane who did all of our Ronin gimbal work. He was sitting up there harnessed in with the Ronin to get the wide shot. We boomed down with Jesse. He stepped off the crane. There was a magnet mount on the car that we mounted onto. What was really cool about timing that is I really didn't want to paint out a big mount on the side of the car. So I wanted to time it so that I landed with that car as it was pulling in. So we were just shooting over the hood and we just missed the mount that he landed on. It would have been if Jesse was 3 feet back or half a second earlier, we would see the entire passenger side of the car and see the mount. But I really didn't want to see that, and I didn't want VFX to have to paint that out. We really tried to avoid paint outs whenever possible. So he stepped off and planted it on this mount that was rigged with electromagnets, which are battery powered. So there's a grip who's, you know, unbuckling Jesse from the crane. Jesse's stepping off, um, and then there's someone he's setting that gimbal with the magnet plate onto the magnet mount. There's a grip switching on that battery to turn the magnet on. There's someone, then safetying the camera onto that rig, and then the guys are driving off seamlessly. We get to the next location, and that we actually stitched because we couldn't get Jesse. We couldn't feasibly get Jesse to the next spot fast enough. We actually did that in other scenes. We were able to actually another part, the beginning of the Noir episode, there is a point where we do that and he actually chases after them and picks it off the golf cart. But for this, we pan off of them to the front of the chateau, and then in that pan we have a stitch where we move into handheld. But we did in the beginning of the episode, there's a golf cart scene where we did the exact same thing. There's actually some behind the scenes online of it, where Jesse's on the Chapman crane, comes down, steps off, plants it on the golf cart. He then jumps in a golf cart that's chasing after it. They drive. He jumps off of his golf cart, grabs it, and takes it off the Magnum out, and they keep going. It's really fun. It's great.
And so, do you get as much excitement about once you've come up with the shot, then trying to figure out our ways to do it? Like you're talking to your grips, you're talking to your team, and everything like that, and trying to figure out ways, or is it purely the shot itself? Yeah.
No, it's so fun. I mean, I love, like, I'm not a big tech guy, but I love rigging. I'm so fascinated by rigging. Like, I love the grip world. I love all the pieces and all the tools, and I think it probably drives my key grip crazy because I'm always trying to call out what tool he should use, and he's like, just show me the shot. Don't tell me what tools to use. But I really love, I just love seeing like a rig built out of speed rail and pipe come together. I think it's the coolest thing on earth, and I love how you can rig to anything. No, it's to me, it scratches an itch that is just so satisfying to me. And again, it's never about the tech, but I do appreciate that process and I love it. And like for me, I'm less interested in like the newest gimbal. I'm literally like, how much speed rail can we put on this golf cart? That to me is fun.
Yeah, you're talking to somebody who writes newsletters for a grip company who have all these like rig of the week and stuff, and I love every second of it. You know what I mean? So
No, I love that. I love all the like, and we tested a lot of stuff early on, and we had all these like remote sliders and uh, magnet mounts for techno cranes, and we ended up not using a lot of that stuff because it was like one step too complicated. And I think what we realized is like it was always, we always went back to what is the simplest approach to anything, because you really don't want to ruin an 8-minute take because some like new piece of tech that came out that is still in beta mode failed for a reason you don't understand, and the actors are all standing there, Bryan Cranston staring at you, and you're like, I don't have a reason for why this take didn't work. That was the situation I didn't want to get myself into. And that happened a few times, with the Ronin. There's sometimes gimbal issues that is a problem that is so above, just goes over my head. Jesse will try to explain it to me and I just don't understand it. So I've learned very quickly to minimize the amount of variables in every shot. Make it as complicated as possible, but also figure out ways where, it really relies on the hands of the grips, the operators, and the ACs to pull off, and not trusting in some computer technology that we don't fully understand.
Yeah, one of the things that I really enjoyed about the show, in terms of camera, I suppose, in camera effect, I suppose you'd call it, was when he's upstairs inside the studio building, I suppose you'd call it. It's all crazy and all moving and everything like this. As soon as he gets downstairs and he has to look like he's a leader and he's in charge again, we try and stabilize and kind of get a lower angle so he looks a little bit like he's got some more power on him. Was that planned, or was
Sure.
that something? Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was planned to some degree, but again, it was really just reacting to Seth's performance. I think if you're talking about the Ron Howard episode where, you know, they have to give him this note. One thing we did, which I'd like to take credit for, is when he's walking up the steps each time, he runs into somebody who's walking the other way. And I just thought that was hilarious to kind of bring him down a notch. There's a great moment in the first episode where he's running up the stairs after he found out, Martin Scorsese said yes to the Kool-Aid film, where he trips on the stairs. And I think when I saw that happen, I was like, oh my God, we need more of those moments. It's just like someone at the peak, emotional peak, that then gets taken down by some very small physical, blocking moment. So yeah, I think again, it wasn't like we were consciously thinking of that, but I think Seth's performance just informed these little nuances, and I think it's really not about us overthinking it or over explaining it. It's just like, that's when Seth's running, the camera's running, and so it's going to feel crazier. When Seth stops to compose himself, the operator gets a second to stop and catch his breath and compose himself. And we really just imitated what was happening on screen, in front of us.
Yeah, there's a lot of Seth falling and rolling and stuff like this, and I always think, crying out loud, like there's a lot for the camera operator to do here.
The studio was a project where I knew I wanted to have a camera operator. I knew I didn't want to be operating because we were doing these long takes. It was going to be really physical. It's not that I'm not in good shape, but I really wanted somebody who could just take that on and be a total beast. And our operator, Mark Golnick, was exactly that. And he's has incredibly good instincts. He has an incredible resume. I'd never worked with him before, but I could just tell from the work he had done in the past that he was going to be perfect for it. Super athletic, but also very artistic eye and a great collaborator. And that to me is the perfect example of a place where having an operator make complete sense. Because I think if I was operating, for that many days straight, there's a point where my brain would just stop working as well. And it's really helpful to have someone who's able to take that on, and so that I can be sitting at the monitor and calling things out, working with lighting, working with the other assistants, working with the other departments to make the shot better.
There's points in it where I think there's one in the one-er, which I was going to ask in a minute, but in the one-er where he's doing these whips back and forth, suppose a bit like Black Swan or La La Land, you know what I mean? Like he's swinging from one thing to another like this. And it's like you think, crying out loud, there's a lot of athleticism going on here with this camera operator, you know what I mean? Especially when they're not really wearing a harness or anything like that. They're pretty much wearing it over the shoulder.
Totally.
You know?
Yeah, he was doing it all. We would just strip the camera down, and he was, a lot of times he wasn't even holding it on his shoulder. He was just holding it, with his bare hands, which is an insane physical feat. But it's also really amazing because he has to memorize every beat of the script. Mark knew the script better than anyone else on the crew. He'd show up every morning, and just I would see him. He would be there before anyone else, and he's just sitting there with the script, trying to memorize every beat and every line. Because if you miss one beat, you've ruined the take. If you miss one pan, you've ruined the take, and we have to go back to one. So we really relied on him to understand the energy and the nuance of every scene.
Wow. Speaking of the Ron Howard episode, Alphabet City, was that a Ron Howard directed thing, or was that something that you were pastiche
No,
as a style?
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely just a cheap ripoff.
Yeah.
I think that was we would look at references and be like, okay, what is this sort of like cheeseball version of what he would do? And I think we would have loved to have Ron direct that, but I don't think we could have afforded it. And it wasn't really what it was about. So we just, one thing we said we would do with all the films within films is shoot it on anamorphic, just to give it a different feel, which I think helped. And then I also just leaned into a lot of filmmaking tools we weren't using on the show. Like, we did a lot of kind of more impressionistic lighting, and, did a lot of like techno crane moves and, car mounts and things like that we were doing in the show, but in a different style. So it was fun. It's fun to flex some different muscles on the show.
There's a scene in that episode, and a spoiler alert for anybody. I've probably thrown that in way too late, but there's a scene in that where you start on Catherine Hahn, where she's showing the poster, and then you kind of move across to Ron Howard sitting at the foot of the table on the opposite side of the table, and it's one of these where I suppose when you're in a 21mm lens, your camera operator is climbing across the conference table, right? Literally crawling towards him. Would that be correct?
Well, it's funny. A lot of people have asked about that. And, people have asked if they did that. People have asked if he was on a wire rig.
Or if two people were holding it on a... Yeah.
Yeah. We spitballed a lot of different ideas. And it was actually Seth who had the best idea. And he was like, why don't we just cut the middle out of the table and replace it in post? So that's what we did. We called it the donut table. And it was literally a table it was the same table, but it just had the middle cut out of it. And on either end, it had little door flaps that could go up and down or get pulled out. So we could be moving around the table. Catherine Hahn could be leaning on the end of the table, resting on it. So, we weren't able to remove that. So, we'd be moving around the table, move just as we move past her, just as she exits frame, she's rolling back in her rolling chair away so that a grip can come in, pull that into the table out. Mark, our operator, then slides into the table, and then he's moving along the table. And obviously we caught a lot of empty space where the table should be. So then VFX had us shoot just tons of plates from different angles of the real table so that they could then patch that in. Unfortunately, the lighting in there was quite consistent, and there weren't a ton of shadows, so it wasn't a total nightmare for them to bring it back in. But yeah, it really was just the most conducive way to shoot all those conference room scenes, because that room was always kind of a nightmare for us when we were thinking about it in prep. We're like, how do we shoot a scene with a bunch of people sitting around a table and keep it interesting? Yeah, and Seth had the brilliant idea of literally just cutting the middle of the table out so we could get in the middle of the conversation. We did that so many times.
And I suppose there's a glass window there that's reflecting everything. Did you paint that out, or was that something whereby you managed to just kind of keep away from any reflection?
You know what? We had all the glass on vertical gimbals. So, depending on the shot, we could just tweak it one way or the other to cast a reflection in a different way. And then of course there's, most of the reflection solves were really very scrappy. It was usually our key grip Adam Collegas with a flag standing behind the operator, and I can still watch some episodes and see a little reflection of somebody. And, when we were doing color correction, I would try to call out as many of those as I could, but sometimes we'd miss one. And honestly, I love it. I love that I get to see some reflections of my crew. And like, it's really like once or twice, maybe, but I think that stuff's special. I think it reminds us that we're making something.
Hey, I was alerted to it in Oppenheimer, and I had to go back and watch a few times. Eventually saw it right in the reflection of some glasses. I was like,
Yeah.
There's how you met.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. No, I don't mind that stuff. I love it, honestly.
No, me neither. What about final? I suppose I'm into my last couple of questions now because we haven't got much time with you. But the one-er about the one-er, episode 2, with Sarah Polley. So is it a one-er first of all? And how did you pull that off? You've got seemingly 2 crews moving around and all this kind of stuff. It was at golden hour, which sounds like it's an even more complicated undertaking. You know what I mean? How many days? Talk me through it.
So we shot for 4 days. Um, we couldn't do it as a oneer. I mean, maybe there's a version where we could have done it as a oneer, but I think it would have been irresponsible and a disservice to, we would have only had 4 takes of the entire thing, which I think is just a disservice to the comedy and the material. I think there's always a balance of being dogmatic about something for the sake of being dogmatic about it, and then there's respecting the material and respecting the actors. So we shot over 4 days. We also didn't have all the actors all 4 days, so we had to split it up, and we just took it on piece by piece. We started at the beginning and just moved through it until we were done. And so we basically shot it in 4 sections, the first section being the drive up and the first introduction to the set and moving into the set. And I'm not exactly sure where we ended the first day, but I think we got through like the dressing room and back into the backyard area and maybe to the video village. And then, yeah, so basically we just kind of chunked it up like that and found stitch points, and we had to shoot a magic hour. That location was an absolute nightmare. Uh, it's one of my favorite locations, but I couldn't have picked a less conducive place to shoot that episode. When we were first talking about the episode, I was thinking about it. I was like, okay, if we pick the right location, I could, light it to feel like magic hour no matter the time of day. That's something that I'm asked to do all the time, and it's not that big of a deal. It's like, sure, you've got a room with windows, if you're smart about how you shoot it, you can block the direct sun and you can shoot window, light in from a lower angle and make it feel like dusk all day. Um, and of course, Seth and Evan fall in love with a location that's on the top of a ridge that has nothing but glass wall. It's all glass walls. It's a completely open design with glass walls. And so I was like, all right, that's challenging. Maybe I can put some cranes up there that are out of shot to add some light and to block some sun. A lot of times we'll fly, either diffusion or big black solids over a location to block direct sunlight so we can push our light in. I get there and the location is literally on a ridge where on either side of the house it just drops down. So there's literally no flat spots. There's barely enough space to put the camera cart, so that lighting it or diffusing light was out of the question. So we just decided, okay, we have to shoot this at dusk every single day. So we would show up to set in the morning and rehearse for like 8 hours and then wait. We'd start rolling maybe an hour before the sweet spot, and we would just roll into sunset and shoot until it was too dark every day.
Wowzers. Honestly, the brilliant thing about this whole series is I've got a friend who was a former VP of a studio, well, Universal, it doesn't matter, but a Universal studio. And I talked to her and she said, it gives me anxiety attacks, but I love I love the series. So it's one of these, it's like, clearly there's people who've had some war stories to tell about about this industry.
No, I think it's definitely people feel definitely people in the industry definitely feel sane. I think some people feel attacked. it was it was very funny. I went to a couple premieres. I went to the premiere at South by Southwest in Austin, which is full of just like film lovers and movie buffs and young people who love movies, old people who love movies. I don't know. It's really just like a fans festival, and the screening was like an absolute riot. Like I could barely hear the dialogue of the show because there was just so much laughter and chatting. And then you go to the LA premiere, which is full of industry people, which there was, it was still a great premiere. It still played really well, but I could literally sense the tension in the room. There was a lot of there were a lot of people in that room who were being made fun of, and you could feel it. And it's a very different vibe, but everyone still loved it. And I think everyone was able to laugh.
It's great. I really hope it gets a second season. I really do. And you talked about South by Southwest there. I know you've got a lot of fans there from your previous work as well. Adam, it's been such a pleasure. One One thing I'll shout out as well for anybody who wants to see it, if you go on Vimeo, Adam's got a short film on there. It's called Greenwood. I really love it. It's 20 minutes. It calms me down at the end of the day. But if you ever need to watch it, it's wonderful.
Oh, nice. Thanks,
Two
man.
blokes going out
Yeah, I
into
love that.
Yeah, it's great. I really like it. What have you got coming up? Have you got anything that you can tell us about, or is it stuff that's all under wraps, so you've got to keep it all secret?
I'm prepping a film that we start shooting next week that I'm not allowed to talk about yet, but it'll be announced in about a month. Hopefully, if no one finds out about it, it'll be announced in a month. We'll see. It's a small movie, but we're really excited about it. Thank you.
Amazing work, Adam. Honestly, thank you so much for joining us. I wish you all the best with everything that goes on in the future, including the studio. And thank you so much for joining me on Finding the Frame. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Adam.
Have a good one.
All right, see you later. Thank you. Bye now.